We've got coming up, well, about 85, 90 people so far coming in. So it's wonderful to see how many people are interested to be part of this. So yeah, this is a session on ritual for online gatherings. It's the first session in our series on ministry in a time of pandemic. And reasons for us wanting to offer this are obvious. You know, our lives have changed unrecognisably over the last couple of months in just about every way that we can imagine. And of course, for many of you, your jobs, your informal leadership roles in your communities have changed as well, as you've been trying to navigate, you know, how do we support our communities through all of this. And so our thinking behind hosting this series of events is really thinking about, well, what are the things that might be helpful? What do we know the challenges are that people are experiencing right now in supporting their communities? And this is the first one, looking at how we use ritual, make online gatherings meaningful. I'm sure you've all been in like more Zoom meetings than you ever be in over the last couple of months. And I'm sure there's been plenty that have just felt exhausting and draining. And it doesn't need to be that way. So hopefully we'll be learning some more about that today. And there's more sessions, one this evening on imagining the future, tomorrow afternoon on self-care and leaders, and tomorrow evening on grief and how we navigate grief collectively. But I'm really excited to introduce the guests that we've got today. So we've got Casper ter Kuile, who's joining us from New York. He's a Ministry Innovation Fellow at Harvard Divinity School and co-founder of the Sacred Design Lab. And he's written a book which is coming out next month called The Power of Ritual. And he's going to be talking through some of his experience and insights in all of the work that he's done in exploring how we use ritual in all sorts of different settings. And we've got Rebecca Stevens, who's joining us from Chicago, where she's the Director of Strategy and Design at Mishkan, which is a she's also an artist and has studied forms of art here in the UK. And we've got Tim Hutchings from the University of Nottingham, who's a sociologist of digital religion and has been exploring the world of online church for the last 15 years. And so it feels great to sort of know that for many of us, this feels very new. It's not been doing online ministry for a long time. So I'm going to hand over to Casper. So Casper and I sort of first crossed paths when I was working at Sunday Assembly, and he was leading some work called How We Gather, which was looking at what millennials are doing. And we've had, you know, we've crossed paths many times since then. But Casper, I'd love to bring you into the room. Do you want to tell us a little bit, first of all, maybe about the Sacred Design Lab?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. And I was having a little trouble with sound, and I think I wasn't the only one. So I'd love to hear if you can hear me well, if you just put it in the chat box or give me a thumbs up on your screens. All right, Natalie's saying thumbs up. I'm getting thumbs up from all over the place. Great, thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you all. Thanks for making time. And if you want, it's always lovely to know where everyone's calling in from. So if you want to put in the chat box where you are, that'll give me a nice sense of where across the geography we are. And I've already seen some old friends in here. Lovely to see you, Linda, and a couple of other friends as well. So hello. And I also want to ask, I think you might have got a mention from Liz and Rory to bring a little candle if you could. This is the perfect moment if you maybe just forgot about that, to grab your candle and obviously something to light it with, because we'll need that later on. So just keep that safe next to your computer. We'll make sure not to spill any hot wax anywhere, shall we? So yes, I met Liz when I was writing a little paper called How We Gather, which looks like this, and you can still read online. And what was interesting about the research that we were doing at Harvard Divinity School was we were looking at how the changing trends in religion were impacting where people were gathering, especially younger people. So if more and more people, obviously in the UK as well as in the US, are less and less religious in terms of attendance and affiliation, where are people going to experience community, connection, meaning? Because our sense was that, you know, as human beings, we're meaning-making creatures, we're social creatures, and inevitably we're going to look to be together in some way, even if we're not doing it in a traditional religious space. And so we kind of mapped this landscape of a whole new set of communities that were meeting in fitness groups or creative groups like maker spaces. We looked at justice groups. We looked at all sorts of communities that you would never think of as doing religious things. But nonetheless, this was a place where people were having their weddings, where they were going for counseling and advice after the loss of a loved one. All sorts of questions of meaning, as well as getting involved in raising money to help someone with their healthcare, for example, or to support someone as they were diagnosed with an illness. So we were looking at new communities, and so my work has always been focused on trying to understand how religion is changing, where people are going to find connection and meaning, and what the future of spirituality and community look like. So what I want to take you through today are some of those trends, and in particular, what they look like now during these COVID times, and what it means for people like you who are community leaders, who are religious leaders, gathering people together to help people feel connected and make meaning of life. The first thing I want to say is it's hard. It's really hard. So I know for many of you, you're having to learn new technologies very quickly. You're having to figure out new solutions. You're having to adapt. And often it's not just you that's adapting, but the congregation or the community that you're leading. So everything I'm sharing here is with a great dose of compassion and understanding. So let me say that first, because I know it's not easy. So let me take you through some of the kind of key trends of what's happening with COVID specifically. We've done some research over the last 3 weeks with an organization here in the US, looking at what are people's lives like, how have they changed since the beginning of the pandemic, and particularly what it's meant for their experience of connection and meaning. Now, I'm going to extrapolate from America onto the UK, so you'll have to help me understand if I'm getting it wrong, but I trust you will. There's 3 key themes that came out time and again. The first is that the rhythm of our daily life has just changed. We've lost a lot of the sense of the daily rhythm, the sense that you might have your morning commute, you might expect to see a certain person for lunch, you might do a school run at the end of the day, then you're going to cook dinner, then you're going to watch this TV show. The sense of predictability and the rhythm has been completely disrupted. It also means that if for those of us who are working, when is the work day come to an end and when do we relax in the evening? What's the difference between a Tuesday and a Saturday? Right, that in many ways, one day just bleeds into another. So the traditional markers of time have been disrupted, and the traditional markers of place have also been disrupted, because we're all mostly, unless you're Dominic Cummings, staying in the same place. So one of the things that's really challenging is that our relationships, and this is kind of the second theme, have massively shrunk. The kind of pool of who we're spending our time with has diminished rapidly, because we're spending more and more time with the same people. That might be the people that you live with, of course, but it might also be people spending more time connecting with their family, or a kind of a closer circle. You might have a weekly Zoom call with your kids or your parents or your sister or whatever it is. And so there's been a real disruption there as well between the kind of outer circles of relationship. So if you think you're going deeper with the people close to you, but maybe some friends or acquaintances or even strangers, you're having way fewer interactions with on average. And so again, we're seeing a kind of breakdown of those traditional structures of relationship. So rhythm is disrupted, our relationships are transformed, and all of that is giving us a real sense of reckoning, that this is a moment where we're having to face big questions. How do we want to live? What am I for? Is what I'm doing really important? Like, is this, and I know you won't be having that feeling because I know you're all doing things that are important, but for a lot of people, there's a sense of questioning of what is life for? What am I doing? And so in that time of reckoning, people are turning towards meaning. They're looking for ways to ask big questions. And so in some ways, there's never been a better time to be a Unitarian, because people are looking for ways to explore life's big questions, but they want to do it in a way that still feels, kind of in sync with their values. They want it to be aligned with the things that are important to them in life. And you know better than I do that for a lot of the British population, once they hear about Unitarians, they're like, oh wow, I didn't even know this was a thing. Wow, this is great. I've always looked for something like that. So all of that is to say, in some ways, this is a really ripe moment, I think, to invite people into community life. And it's not just older people. In America, 46% of Gen Zs, which is the youngest generation that we have right now, up to age 22 or so, have tried a new religious practice. 46% have tried something new since the beginning of COVID. So that might be they've tried meditation, maybe they've attended an online service of some sort, maybe they're journaling. So people are trying new things. They're looking for ways to kind of calm themselves and feel connected, but also to probably be part of something bigger than themselves in some way. So all of that is to say, this is a real moment of opportunity. So that's part one. But of course, we can't just invite people into our doors of the traditional buildings. And to some extent, I want to offer a little provocation to say that might be a good thing, because it's very challenging to try and invite someone into an existing structure which they feel is foreign and perhaps a bit scary. They don't quite know what's going to happen there. So it's an interesting time in which kind of all of the traditional boundaries and markers of what religious life looks like, what community life looks like is changing. And we're having to use tools like Zoom, like we are today, which are not designed for community. Right? This was a tool that was designed for business. So one person speaks at a time. I can share my screen and give you a PowerPoint presentation, and all sorts of things that you would expect to happen in an office environment. But the tech tools that we have access to are not designed for community. So we haven't yet got a technology that allows us to sing together, right? We haven't yet got a technology that allows us to feel like we're in a physical space together, where I look to my right and I can see Jane, and I look to my left and I can see Arik. You're all just grids on a screen. So in this moment, we're kind of having to retool technologies that were designed for one thing for something else. I think that will change in the next year. So God willing, we'll have all sorts of wonderful new tools and toys to play with that will help stimulate community and ritual life. But again, this is tricky, and we're having to do things that were not designed for this purpose. So all of us have to develop some new skills. And we have to try some new things out. And that's really what today's conversation is all going to be about, is to think, how can we use tools like Zoom to try new ways of bringing people together in ritual? So I'm going to talk you through 5 principles that you can use when you're designing ritual online, which I'm hoping you can adapt to make sense in your context, because you'll know your community best. But I really want to invite you to kind of lean in to experimenting a little bit. This is a time when people are very forgiving. Everyone knows that other people are doing it for the first time, so it's a great time to try something new, and to see what people make of it. So great opportunity for creativity and trying something new. So I will share these 5 principles in a PDF with Liz afterwards, so you don't have to write them down. You'll get them. I mean, if you want, you're welcome to write them down, but you'll get a written copy of this later on. But these are kind of 5 principles to help with online ritual. So the first thing to say is that just because we're on a screen together doesn't mean that we're actually in a physical place. If you want, you can just look around you to remind you where you are. I am, for example, in my open plan. This is the dining table on which you're standing. There's my living room. There's the kitchen. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York. And so the first thing you want to think about is kind of preparing the space in which you are in before you go online. So for example, you might have seen on Twitter the kind of rate my background account, where people get given marks out of 10 for what the background behind them says about them. There's been all sorts of scandals about people who've had unsavory books in their bookcases. So even though we're looking at you, we can still see what's behind you. So you want to think about, how can I prepare the physical space that I'm in if I'm leading a ritual that will help people feel the kind of feeling I want to instill. So for example, if you're officiating a wedding, you want to have something celebratory and decorative and lovely, right? Think about the clothing that you're wearing. I put on a collared shirt this morning because I wanted to be a little bit presentable for you all. But you might want to think about, you might still wear robes, you might wear a party hat, whatever is appropriate. You want to think about the physical space that you're in before you log on and people can see you. I've seen people have gorgeous things with plants. I've seen people change their backgrounds halfway through as if it's sort of a liturgical service. So you can have maybe some drapes in one color that changes. You can do all sorts of wonderful things. And the space that's outside isn't the only thing you want to pay attention to. You also want to think about your inner space. So if you're about to lead a ritual, you will want to take a moment to prepare yourself before you log on to Zoom, so that you're coming into the service with the kind of presence and stillness and clarity that will help other people get there too. So you want to prepare the outer space, and you want to think about preparing your inner space. Does that make sense so far? Just give me a little hand wiggle. This is the applause sign for those. Yes, lovely. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. So preparing the space, setting the scene for something special. The second thing you want to think about is how to mark time. So of course, kind of entering a Zoom room is kind of like, oh, here we are. Suddenly everyone's there. You probably felt that as you arrived in today. Unlike, walking into a room and having a sort of gentle arrival moment, it's kind of a brutal entry, right? So you might want to think about, how can you mark time which feels a little bit more organic. So one thing that I've seen people do, for example, is to open the Zoom room about 10, 20 minutes beforehand. And rather than having preludes playing, you can stream music through your computer, for example. So it kind of feels like it's, we had a waiting room today, which is another nice way of doing it. You can also kind of just open the waiting room and have music playing. So people arrive one by one, and oh, there's Jane, oh, there's Chris. You have that lovely sense of connection, especially if people already know each other in the congregation or the community. It's a nice way of kind of gently starting. And then when you want to mark the time beginning, just think of lighting the chalice or other ritual moments that say, okay, this is where we're starting. And then the same as at the end. You kind of close the service, but you don't have to kick everyone out straight away. you can let people hang around a little bit, have a little chat afterwards, and kind of just give a sense of time holding people as well as the space that we talked about before. You can also use, for example, I've done in different sessions, rather than a candle, you can invite people to take a breath together. So you might invite people, to take a breath, invite them just to let go whatever was happening before them, to take a second breath to kind of set an intention for the time, and then a third breath to kind of get going together. You'll know better than I do for your community what's the right thing to do, but just think of helping people mark this time as different from the rest of their day. If they've probably just, you know, spoken to Auntie Sue, they had a meeting for work, you know, they're figuring out, you know, who's going to do the shopping, all sorts of life is happening. You want to help give people a sense that this is a time that's set apart in some way. Does that make sense? Think about time as well as space. Okay, fab. All right, let's go to number 3, which is about using real physical things. One of the biggest challenges is that when we think about ritual online is we all focus on the screen. So we're all looking at this blooming screen the whole time. It's not necessary. We can still use physical things. We've got a cup of tea here. We've got our candle, which we'll use in a moment. You might want to use incense. You might want to use, you know, people can have books. People can have material, like a cloth, for example, that they put over their shoulders. You know, there's all sorts of ways in which you can use real things, multi-sensory experiences that enrich the visual and the audio part of the screen. And we don't always need to orient ourselves looking at the camera. So for example, if I'm performing a ritual, I could be doing it over here, right? I might be pouring water from a bowl into another. I might be, you know, whatever it is. So you don't always need to look at the screen to feel like you're leading this ritual. The other part of it is, of course, that it's not just you as the leader who needs to think about multi-sensory ritual leadership. This is so much fun because everyone at home can do it too. So this is a really great moment to actually invite leadership from the congregation or the community to participate in the same ritual as you. So as long as you give them clear instructions on what people need to bring, they will be able to do it at home. I'll give you an example. In 2018, my colleagues and I ran a year-long online experience of spiritual deepening. It was called the Formation Project. And Rory, perhaps you can find the website and put it in the chat box. It's formationproject.io. And what we invited people to do over the first 3 months was to discern whether they were ready to be part of a small group. And so for those of you familiar with small groups, you'll know it's a big commitment. This was an online small group that met every week. So it was a very high bar. So the first 3 months were just helping people assess if this was something they were ready to do. And of the 75% or so of the folks who said they were, we hosted a commitment ceremony after those first 3 months. And the rituals that we created in the commitment ceremony, all of which was on Zoom, included those 3 breaths. It included lighting a candle, but it also included 2 other rituals that I want to talk you through. One of them was we wanted to illustrate that even though we were far away from one another, because all of this was online, we wanted people to feel connected. And so what we did, and here's one I prepared earlier. We invited everyone, I'm back. We invited everyone to bring a piece of cloth. So it might have been a prayer shawl, it might have been a favorite throw or a coat, anything. It could be any piece of cloth. And we invited them at the moment when we had talked about how we would connect with one another, how we'd support one another through this year-long journey. We invited them to put on the piece of cloth around their shoulders. I know it sounds really silly and small, but the weight of the cloth on our shoulders, and especially how it kind of hugs you around the neck, even now while I'm doing it, it feels so lovely. It feels like someone's giving me a hug. So if you're thinking about a ritual that's about connecting with each other, even from afar, just thinking about how can you do something that feels kind of like it's surrounding you, like it's comforting you, something like that can be really, really lovely. Another thing that we did was to invite people to illustrate that they were present. And we did this a little bit over the chat. You know, you wrote down where you're calling in from. We invited everyone to unmute themselves one by one in alphabetical order and say their name out loud, just their name. And we invited people to use, you know, their full name, so their middle name. Some of them had a religious name or a name in another language. And it was this moment of real kind of a real it was quite emotional, honestly, because it was this moment of people saying, I am here, I'm committing to this thing. And so one by one, people unmuted themselves, said their name, and then muted themselves again. Again, it sounds really small, but it was a lovely way to take this kind of nameless box of faces and everyone having a moment to speak into the whole group. So again, using real things, using our voices, using our physical touch, you know, have people light incense at home, have people smell a plant maybe, or maybe they picked a flower that day, invite everyone to smell it at the same time. So just finding ways for people to really lean into the physical reality of the world around them. Okay, nearly there. Finally, sorry, two more. The fourth one is about leaning into the new. So one of the biggest mistakes we can make as ritual designers is to just try and take what we did together in person and put it online. It does not work. It's always going to be a less good version of what we love. And there's nothing more demoralizing. So don't do that, please. It's very easy to think, oh, we'll just stream, you know, a traditional service and I'll be in the, you know, I'll be in the church building and do it on my own. That honestly, that lasts about a week. I'm sure you've already experienced this. It doesn't last long term. So what I want you to do is to try and think about, well, what did this part of the service, or what does this ritual try and do? What's underneath the outer form? What's the inner power that it's trying to communicate? So let me take, you know, a traditional Anglican practice, forgive me. I don't know if this happens in Unitarian churches too, but the passing of the peace, right? When people turn to one another and shake hands or hug or wish one another well, right? That's a moment of being connected to people around you. And depending on your theological perspective, right? It's about being connected in the larger body. So in that moment, I mean, if we're all going to go like this and try and like high five each other, you know, that's nice. But try and think about what's a way in which we can use this technology to achieve the same outcome. So one thing that we'll be doing later on in this session is breaking you out into small groups to speak in groups of 3 or 4 people. So that's a way in which you can use this technological platform to achieve the same outcome, for people to connect with one another in a little bit more personal way, rather than just trying to, you know, match what we used to do. So think about what the purpose is underneath, and then figure out what the technology allows you to do, and play to the strengths of this format. One of the strengths of this format is that people feel very safe at home, rather than going to a strange place where they might not know anyone, doing something for the first time. So people's willingness to risk things is actually much higher in a context like Zoom, because worst case scenario, I can just log off and you're all far away. So I'm going to be fine. So I don't know if you saw, there was a great piece in the Financial Times last week by Nikki Gumbel, who runs the Alpha program, saying that they've had a huge number of new signups in the Alpha program. We can talk about whether Alpha is good or not. The Evangelical Christian kind of small group exploration program. They've had a huge number of signups because people feel more safe to engage with kind of big questions and new people online, rather than in person. So whether we like it or not, there are opportunities for people to lean into things that they haven't done before. So again, something we can try, playing to the strengths of the format. Finally, the last one is to think about helping us connect. So just because we're at distance doesn't mean that we can't feel connected to one another. And one of the things that we're really missing, which I mentioned before about how our relationships have shrunk and deepened, and the things that we're missing are the kind of outer circles of connection. One of the things that we're really missing are the kind of lovely, small, light, kind of serendipitous moments of connection that we feel with people that we might not be, you know, we don't want to be their best friend, but it's lovely just to have a short moment of connection. So think about how can you design for moments of kind of serendipity, moments of just a light connection. So one of the ways that I've been doing that over the last few weeks was to host a Sunday singing group, and my husband and I would teach songs line by line, very simple rounds. So not really multi-harmony things, not anything that needed music to read from, but just songs that you could learn by ear. And people would sing along at home, and you know, we would teach the song line by line. We'd sing it a number of times, and then people would sing it in a round with us. Very simple. But one of the best moments in that hour was when we would unmute everyone and for like 2 moments of chaos, everyone would sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, which is a song most of us know. But it was just a joyful moment where we could hear everyone, we could have a little burst of connection, and then we could go back to singing more songs that were easier to do, you know, with everyone muted. But so there's little ways in which we can still feel, you know, we can hear people's voices. Maybe we can spotlight one person in the congregation to tell the story about their week, what was a high and a low, just some sweet ways in which you can help us connect, especially over time. Because that's one of the things I think we're all realizing now, is that this isn't just for the next few weeks, but this is going to be for a long time to come. So how can we design for relationships that will build over time? Perhaps you can start small groups, perhaps you can start, you know, phone tree buddies, all sorts of ideas that are out there. I've gone on far too long, so I am going to bring it to a close there. As again, I'll send over those 5 principles with a little bit of detail about each one, so you'll have them to read. But what I want to do now is just to practice a little bit of what we've preached. So this is the moment to find your candle, if you've got one. So you'll want matches and a candle, or a lighter and a candle. If you want to use a chalice, that's fine. I've just got a normal candle over here. And what I'm going to invite you to do is just to kind of, let's go through those 5 principles. Let's go through them in real life. So the first thing was about setting our space. And I want you to just prepare your inner space for the small groups that we're going to have in a moment, for the conversation that's going to come as a whole group. And I want you to just think about your intention over this next hour. Perhaps you want to learn, perhaps you want to build your courage to try something new. Perhaps you want to get to know Liz a little bit better, who is so amazing. So just let's take 30 seconds of quiet. Just find an intention that you want to set for yourself in the coming hour. Find an intention for the next hour. Wonderful. And if you want, you can write it in the chat box. If you want to share with people, you don't have to. But if it's a way of keeping yourself accountable, you can do that. What we'll do now is we'll just mark the time of opening the panel discussion. We're going to hear from Tim and Rebecca, and then we'll break out into small groups for all of you to connect with one another as well. So we're going to mark the time of conversation by lighting the candle. And you can just hold it up to the camera. You can see all these other people all over the place with their candles as well. Hopefully no one's burning themselves. Excellent work. And just put it down next to your computer, somewhere safe. If you're anything like me, it's a lovely way to feel like, even though we're all in our own places, there's a little candle burning that represents our connection. So with that, amazing. Let me hand it over to Liz.
Thank you so much, Casper. Just a really concise sort of wave of information there, and all really resonating and feels really valuable. So thank you for that. And it's lovely to kind of see all of the candles. So Rebecca and Tim, I'm really interested for us to hear from your experience as well. And I wonder, Rebecca, whether if we go to you first, if you'd like to share some of your experience with Mishkan.
Sure. Let's just check my sound. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, great. Sound is looking good. Hello. I feel like I have to say good morning because it's 8:30 a.m. in Chicago, which is where I am. So I am Rebecca. I work as the Director of Strategy and Design at Mishkan Chicago. It's a Jewish spiritual organization here in Chicago. And I have a little bit of an unusual job. And I am by training a theater director and a theater artist. I still work professionally in theater. And then over the past 5 years or so, Mishkan became a place that was a place I was sort of trying out as I was very much one of these millennials thinking about how to gather. And my husband and I were wondering, how are we Jewish as 20-somethings? And then kind of got scooped into really making and designing rituals and being really involved in creating how folks come together. I will type in Mishkan Chicago is like this, and our website is mishkanchicago.org. The Mishkan is the traveling tabernacle that the Jews who left Egypt used as they wandered the desert for 40 years. And so Mishkan started in a living room in, I think, 2011. About 20 people showed up with a really dynamic rabbi, Rabbi Lizzie. You can go on our website and hear a lot more about her. She's really fantastic. And then it's grown to over 4,000 people come to our services and programs a year. So it has sort of exploded in growth and is a really exciting place to be. So I, as a theater artist, very much work in the live. And then I have had to think about what I do translating to digital space, like you all are doing. And when lockdown first happened in Chicago, Mishkan moved really, really fast. We transferred all of our programs and all of our experiences online in about a week. And we did that for two reasons. One was sort of a feeling of a call to action, and our staff really worked around the clock. And the second was just frankly that I was 35 weeks pregnant, and I knew if I didn't do it then, I was probably not gonna have a chance to do it. And so we had to just make a lot of choices very, very quickly, and that really helped us have to let go of whether or not we thought it was the perfect choice and instead get to really see what has happened over the last couple months. So I just want to share a couple of examples that I think are really going to illustrate some of what Casper is talking about. The first thing I just want to remind us is that any sort of ancient tradition is inherently well designed, which is to say that it's lasted, right? And so Judaism, has a couple thousand years on Unitarianism. But I will say Jews, like Unitarians, have a huge range of belief, right? So folks who identify as Jewish come into Mishkan, our place of worship, and they might be staunch atheists, but they feel a cultural heritage and a tradition. They might never come to services, but they call when their mother died. And so much like other humanist traditions, Judaism holds this enormous space where belief and faith is not the anchoring principle. And so I just want to say you are working with material that has lasted, which means there is something in it that is compelling and that you can trust and go back to. The second part of that is it's lasted because it has adapted over time. If you think about all the forms of technology that Unitarianism has adapted to, I would say like electricity would be one of them, that these traditions, these humanist traditions, these faith traditions have moved through the ages, and people have always been adapting to it. We just haven't felt it quite acutely or at quite high speed. So the question I asked myself first and foremost when I was trying to think about what do we do? How do we translate this incredible in-person experience where 200 people every week stand in a circle. We do all of our services in the round and we sing. It's all in Hebrew and it's all singing for 2 hours, which is a disease vector, right? That is a perfectly terrible thing. And it is what has drawn 4,000 people to join us throughout a year. So I asked myself, why are people turning here? Which I think is a really great question. At the time, a lot of Jewish organizations were putting out resource sheets. And I was a little bit like, oh God, no one needs to read, like all we're doing is reading things. All of us are just trying to there's endless links to look at. And that people didn't want that. That what I decided, or what my team and I decided, is that people were looking for structure and for connection. And this really taps into what Casper was just talking about that people's rhythms have changed and that people's, where they're talking to feels really small or they feel very isolated. So we thought a lot about how do we create structure? And the other thing about it is I wanted to create, and I thought about it as buckets, buckets that we could fill in our organization over and over again. That if every week we were reinventing what we were doing, we were going to be exhausted. And what we started talking about was we did a morning, probably some of you have already been doing this as well. We did a morning service. In Judaism, there's a morning minyan, which usually is only done by Orthodox folks, right? It's a much more traditional practice. But we started doing it, and people would lead meditations, and we'd go through the morning prayers. So that happened every morning at 8 a.m. And then we started having lunch and learns, where we would just have community members who had something interesting to offer. We solicited twice a week, and then someone ran a knitting club. Someone taught how to do side shaves for people who are trying to learn how to buzz their hair. Some folks taught a lesson on Torah and resilience, because we had a scholar in our community. Really ran the gamut. Someone taught a lesson on how to give blessings in the Jewish faith. And then we did an evening, we did different some of our classes we translated online. And then we also then had a couple other classes and things going. So we thought about it as sort of like people needed structure throughout the day. The other thing is we thought about kids and families. We do run an education kids programs as well. And that's a great example of us adapting. We started by having kind of like a mid-morning song thing that our education team led. And then no one needed it at 10 a.m. What people needed it was at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. when their kids were freaking out, and they were also starting to freak out. And so now they do a sort of cool down. And so again, it's not about landing it exactly, but it's just an example of where we were like, what do we think people could use? Let's try it and see who comes. And I was routinely just really surprised with how many people filled up for all these different things. And then in terms of connection, the other thing we did is we sent out an email saying, if you would like to volunteer in some capacity with us, not social, like we won't be asking people to be in face-to-face contact. This was really the first or second week of lockdown. Please fill out this form. And what we had in mind was that people were going to call the older folks on in our community, and 150 people filled out that form. And we're like, please give me something to do. People want purpose right now. This is a really scary time where a lot of us feel like we don't know how to have any control or help at all. And so we ended up pairing every single person in our congregation now has gotten a phone call from someone else. It's the kind of thing that would never happen in our before times. And all of a sudden we just had it there. So it was an example of just when you can and we just started by being like, let's put out the form. Let's see who signs up. If 8 people sign up, we'll have them each call 4 people who are over 80, right? That was the original plan. And then we had more people than we knew what to do with, and we really had to think about it. I do want to acknowledge that we have a bigger staff than probably some of you are working with. We have a full-time staff of about, I think, 11 right now, because we're a fairly big organization. So this is not to say you do all these things, but just to say this is how I thought through what to do. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is about how do you design rituals that are interactive? And this is just, I think, giving a little bit of specificity to some, in my experience, of what Casper was talking about using all the senses. So lockdown happened about 3 or 4 weeks before Passover, which is a really big Jewish holiday, maybe one of the biggest besides the ones in the fall. And Passover, if any of you don't know, really tells the story of the Jews leaving. It's the story of Moses, how the Jews left Egypt, wander in the desert, eventually will reach Israel. And a Passover Seder is usually takes anywhere from 1 to 5 hours. It's a big dinner party. The idea of it is you gather people in your home, you tell the story of moving from slavery to freedom, you drink 4 glasses of wine, you eat a ton of food, you talk and you argue. Again, it's a perfect thing for spreading the coronavirus. And really hard to replicate. You can't have a dinner party on Zoom and with 200 people. That's, again, sort of it was a feeling of loss and of sorrow. So what we did, and it actually, there were things we couldn't have, right? We said, you always say at Passover, next year in Jerusalem, both being the idea of the physical journey, but also Jerusalem as a better place, as what we hope to become. And we just started saying next year in person. But the thing that made a big difference is we had people assemble their own Seder plates, and not everyone knew how to do that. And so we sent it out beforehand, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what might you have in your kitchen that if you can't go to the grocery store, because it was really, grocery stores were a mess. No one wanted to go. People were running out of supplies. So an example is that you eat horseradish on the Seder plate. The idea that you eat something because it commemorates the bitterness of slavery. That's a part of the service. And I said to Rabbi Lizzie, okay, so what's behind that? This is this thing Casper was saying about how do you reach inside of something? And she was like, well, the idea is you eat something so spicy that it brings tears to your eyes. And that is a metaphor for slavery. And then you talk about like, what is the physical feeling of feeling trapped together? And so we said, okay, we made a sheet. I tried to find it. It's not online right now. I'll see if I can send it out through Liz. But we said the ritual object is horseradish. Its purpose is this reason I just explained. And then what's our pandemic version? And we said anything spicy in your kitchen. It might be hot sauce, it might be sriracha, anything you can get. And so people assembled these really joyful Seder plates that we could actually share with each other and talk about what we had done instead, which was actually a way of getting at the ritual behind this and actually led to deeper engagement because people had to paw through their own kitchens. So that's a small example, but I think is a great thing about when you say, okay, I'm going to translate this online, how do you actually go inside the thing and find the meaning? And that hopefully is a little nugget that you can sort of think through and take. The other thing I wanted to say is taking a breath. I know I saw on the chat, someone was like, can you slow down? I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I talk a mile a minute. But it's a good reminder for you to slow down in general when you present, but also, as Casper said, people are really patient right now. And if it means, pausing so people can go and get the thing they forgot when they sat down, it's worth it. So I gave birth during the pandemic. I don't recommend it. It's a stressful experience. And one of the core Jewish traditions is having a bris, which is the ritual circumcision that you have. I have a son. It takes place on the 8th day. It usually takes place in the home. And you gather friends and family. A trained rabbi called a moil, who's trained in circumcision, comes. The father helps hold the baby. The mother hides in the other room, and you do this. And that's one of the fundamental Jewish traditions. Someone once said that we always talk that Jewish people don't proselytize, right? That people don't try to join Judaism. And then someone pointed out that actually the problem was in ancient times, no one wanted to join a religion where you did circumcision. And that's really the reason why Jews don't proselytize. But what we did instead, we had to do it at the hospital. There was no other choice. And US hospitals at that time, I could have my husband with me, but no one else was allowed. And so we were doing this thing that we had planned to do in such a different way a day after, and we were in the hospital with our parents on Zoom and the rabbi on Zoom, which really felt, so many emotions. And what the Rabbi Lizzie did the ceremony. So we did the ceremony together, and then the doctor took the Theo, my son, and Rabbi Lizzie went and she said, we need a glass of wine for this ceremony. So I'm just gonna wait, and had our parents go get glasses of wine. My parents cracked open a bottle of wine at 10 a.m. Sam and I found some cranberry juice in the hospital. And then when we did the ritual with the glass of wine saying the blessings, it was so centering to have the actual ritual object. And, she had mentioned it in an email, but good God, I had just given birth. Like, we're like, I don't know. And it was a really simple, she was like, just go find some liquid, bring it back. We'll do this in 5 minutes. And so I just want to encourage us to say that it's actually okay to take our time and assemble our spaces, and to invite people who are, trying to deal with their kids running through the house while they also are hoping to do this thing with you, to go and get our stuff. As a last thing, and I know I'm going on a bit, I just wanted to add a couple of things I've seen that I find really helpful about Zoom. One is you have your online chat going, and good God, people feel more than welcome to comments. And that's great, and it can be a little hard when you're talking, but it's actually a really amazing thing to invite people into, to comment, or to acknowledge the free flow of conversation that's happening. So both prompted and unprompted chats. I was joking with Liz earlier. I spent 2 years living in London when I did my postgraduate work. So I've spent some time in Britain, and that Americans, if you ask them to write out their prayers, they are so ready to go. They will write down all of their fears, all of their prayers, send it right away. So we use that tool a lot. I am skeptical of how much it will translate in the UK, but it's certainly something to think about. Is it's a great way to have people participate, even if you don't go through every single one, right? Sometimes sending it into the universe is enough. The second thing is, for those of you who use Google Docs, I have a lot of friends who've worked with having people look at a common piece of text and then comment on the different parts of it, which actually lets people make much more precise comments, because you can't sort of say a general thing. You really have to choose literally where you're going to highlight and write your comments, which means you have to think about the text a little more and then have a discussion. Something else I just sort of loved that I have grabbed. We've also asked community members to host Zoom rooms. We'll do a discussion, we'll do a big ceremony together, and then we'll break out and have hosts of the rooms, which I just think is a great way to empower people. And then something Casper mentioned again, which is end the event and let people chat. People often hang around, and people who want to leave are going to sign off. The final thing I'll say is, I think it's attributed to Churchill, the quote, "Never waste a good crisis," which I just want to say there are so many things, like, for example, at MucheCon, people calling each other and connecting. We've been wanting to do small groups at MucheCon for several years, and we've never been able to figure out how to start that engine. And suddenly, in the palm of our hands is the thing we wanted to do. So whatever you've been wanting to do, but you feel like now is not the time, now is definitely the time, because the world has changed, and people are looking for ways to connect. So I would sort of invite us all to say that this might be the time to do the ambitious thing. It will probably have to be in a slightly different form, but you know, not to make light of what is a global tragedy, and here in America is really an amazing tragedy of many, many things for those of you who watch US news. But in the microcosm of our communities, it's actually an opening to push, to move forward with our ideas.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, such riches in all of that. And I want to invite Tim to come in. So as I said, Tim's a sociologist of digital religion at the University of Nottingham, and has been really diving deeply into the world of online church since, I think, 2004. So I'm really interested, Tim, if you want to share some of your perspectives from a sort of a much bigger, you know, broader time span, and reflecting on sort of what you've heard Casper and Rebecca say as well, perhaps.
Oh, okay. I had to wait to be unmuted. Can I check, first of all, can you hear me okay? Good, we have some nodding. So yes, as Liz said, I've been working on digital religion research now for a long time. So the main thing that I can tell you, in case anybody didn't know this already, is that the situation we're in now is not new at all. Oh, we have a complaint about the sound. Maybe if I try and move this microphone back here, it might work better. Is that improved the sound at all? Let's hope, maybe. Okay. Yes, so the first online worship event that I know of happened in the 1980s. So what we're talking about here is not new. It's a very, very old process. We've got, if we want to, we've got 30 years of experience to try and learn from. But you can go back further than that. Of course, online worship is not the only kind of option here. You've got television worship, you've got radio worship, you've got people worshipping by post. One of the groups that should be celebrated, certainly internationally, as a pioneer in media ministry is the Unitarian Church. Particularly in America, the Unitarian Universalists were finding ways to do media distant ministry right back to the American Civil War. There are some groups who get motivated to try and talk to each other through media. It's always the same kind of groups whenever a new sort of media technology emerges. The first kind of group, I think we could say, comes out of an experience of community.
Tim, I'm just,
Yes.
I wonder if you could just switch your video off. I think that might help the sound quality.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. So thanks for pointing that out in the chat. So I was trying to think of who are the groups who use new technologies in interesting ways. There's a principle that has been noticed a few times that whenever people start using a new technology to communicate, they talk to each other and they talk to each other and they start building relationships and they start to feel like they're becoming friends through media. And then sooner or later, somebody says, we should use this for spirituality. It's a kind of regular principle of all new media, has been for a very, very long time. As soon as people start feeling like they can get to know one another through a new media technology, people start using it for spirituality. But there are other groups as well that we could think of here. One of those is the category of people who have something to say and they don't have access to the mainstream media of their day. So if you look for media innovation, it usually doesn't come from the best professional media communicators of the moment. It almost never comes from the most powerful and wealthy churches of the moment. It's the people who are in some sense on the margins of the power structure of their day. People who cannot go to the BBC and say, I demand a 1-hour broadcast on Tuesday, please. Those are the people who will start trying to find other ways to communicate their message. That's why the Unitarians got interested in media ministry. They needed a way to share their message, to get in touch with other people who were scattered over a wide distance, and no one was going to give it to them. So they found a new way of doing it for themselves. So within Christianity, you tend to find independent evangelical and charismatic churches right at the forefront of media innovation, whereas the respectable mainline denominations are lagging behind because they don't need to innovate in the same way. That's true across lots of different areas of society. There are wonderful journalists using TikTok and Twitter and other media to share news in completely new ways. You would not have heard of any of those people 3 years ago. It's not the front page headline journalists who are the first to adapt because they don't need to. They've already got their technology set. So you've got people who use the technology, who know it works, start being interested in spirituality. People who haven't got another way to communicate start looking for new innovations. The third key area of innovation is crisis. And this is something that's come up in each of our messages right now, particularly times of tragedy. As Casper said quite nicely, there's something about a crisis that undermines what we think is meaningful, what we think is normal, what we think is common sense, and it opens us up to trying new things. So I mentioned to you that the earliest online service that we know about happened in the 1980s. That was a memorial service in response to the Challenger space shuttle disaster. If you look at the books that have been written about using the internet in religion for 30 years, and they have been written for 20 or 30 years, the early ones almost always have a death story in them. There will be a personal kind of anecdote that says, well, you know, I always thought that digital media was pretty silly, but then there was an earthquake, or then one of my friends died, and we had to come together and do a funeral online because it was the only thing that we could do. So those are some of the factors that have prompted innovation. And of course, as Unitarians using Zoom to try and do church right now, we're kind of bringing together all three of those possibilities. So what else could we say? Casper suggested 5 principles of successful online ritual. What really strikes me listening to those is that actually through this long history of media innovation, people keep rediscovering actually something quite similar. I don't think it's not listed in quite the same way. It's not set up in quite the same way. But if you look at the the inventions that were being proposed in the 1980s and the 90s and the early 2000s, they actually follow quite similar lines. Each new, you could talk about digital generations, maybe like the phases of digital culture, people trying to come to terms for the first time with whatever new technology has been invented that year. And each time something like those 5 principles gets reinvented. So for example, we heard about the idea of everybody singing "Row, row, row your boat" all together, which is a wonderful example of something that works on video chat, video and audio chat. But actually, that's a pretty new aspect of online religion, the idea that we would all be talking to each other face to face. I have been studying this for a long time, and I, as Liz mentioned, started doing my research in 2004. And at that point, the Church of England and the Methodist Church had both launched online churches that were using chat rooms and virtual worlds, the kinds of technologies that were cutting edge a very long time ago. And they were trying to work out ways to do sort of meaningful church without any sort of video or audio link. So people were just typing messages backwards and forwards to each other. And one of the rituals that was invented in that space was the idea that everybody who was present, everybody who was logged into the chat room, would all start typing the Lord's Prayer at the same time. And you would do it in your own language, your own translation, the version you kind of half remembered from school where you'd forgotten some bits in the middle. You would not worry about keeping pace with anybody else. You'd just go as fast as you can. It was absolute chaos, and it was really beautiful. It was a very powerful moment of just the words flying past on the screen at enormous speed, far too quickly for anybody to read. But it was something that people continued doing for about 10 years, at least. That ritual really worked for the people who participated in it. So it's kind of delightful to me now to find that something actually very similar has been reinvented for the video chat generation of online religion. And that, to me, captures maybe an additional principle of online ritual. I don't know if it needs to be added to the 5 principles that Casper has shared, but another possibility, which is silliness. There's something that I've found in following online religion for a very long time, is a kind of ubiquitous silliness. There is almost always something that undermines the seriousness of what's being done, which might be playing a game together after the service, or role-playing what it might be like to have coffee together if you're typing in the chat room. Everyone say, "Who'd like 2 sugars?" Wonderful, I'll have 2 sugars. Or singing "Row, row, row your boat." There is a seriousness to effective online ritual, but there's often also something that pokes fun at that seriousness at the same time. My interpretation of that is that trying to do church or trying to do ritual in this new environment, it's difficult, it is strange. And one way of trying to deal with that strangeness is just to call it out and say, "This is ridiculous. We're all being absolutely absurd." Now we've called that out, we can move through it into something that actually becomes very serious. So I mentioned before that ritual of constantly typing the Lord's Prayer very quickly. That's something that came out of a group called the Church of Fools. Church of Fools was created by, it was created by a website called Ship of Fools. It was funded by the Methodist Church in the UK 15 years ago. And they really embraced a kind of serious silliness, which some people found very off-putting. Well, how could you have a Christian group called the Church of Fools? How dare anyone make fun of the Lord's Church in that way, was a comment that a few people put to me. But it was a space that was very serious and also very silly at the same time. So it existed in a virtual world, a very small virtual world that looked as much as possible like a stone medieval church. It was a very kind of traditional looking space. But in the crypt, there were a whole bunch of comfy armchairs and vending machines. And people used the downstairs crypt space to do wild and silly things. There was what people within the group referred to as a cult of worshipping the vending machines that emerged, which was a kind of one of the things that happened in Church of Fools with a number of people who were interested in but quite hostile to Christianity came along. They would set up an atheist chat space. Oh yes, I will hurry on to wrapping up, don't worry. Yeah, so people came along who wanted to be involved in a spiritual conversation but didn't want to take it too seriously. And it was the silliness of having the openness of vending machines and armchairs and silly games that made it possible for them to participate in the same kind of conversation. So that blend of seriousness and silliness is where I wanted to leave us, I think. People like me have been researching online religion for a very, very long time. What we've tended to find is that it looks very familiar. It tries very hard to reproduce as much as possible of the comfortable and the ordinary, to give people a sense that this is real. It's real ritual because it involves candles or liturgies or churches that you know exist. It looks like church in some way. And at the same time, it's just silly enough to be fun and experimental and not to take it too seriously. Okay, I'll wrap up there because I know we need to move into
small groups. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
Yeah, so much stuff. And everyone's been listening for a long time now, so we want to give you a chance to talk to each other. So I'm going to hand back over to Casper for some invitations to small groups.
Yes. Yeah, and I've seen so many good ideas already in the chat box, so I'm just thrilled that you'll get to talk to one another. What we're going to do now, in a moment, Rory is going to invite you to a Zoom breakout group. Some of you will know what that means. Some of you, this is the first time. What will happen is you'll get a little pop-up screen that will say, accept invitation to room 14 or whatever number it is. You'll click yes, and you'll get sent out into a different Zoom room where you'll meet 2 or 3 others who will be there to chat with. What I want you to do is to explore whatever one of these 3 questions is most exciting to you. So question number 1, what are you inspired to try? Maybe it's something silly like Tim was talking about. Maybe it was one of the rituals that Rebecca was describing that you could adapt in some way. Maybe it's one of the things you've already been thinking about, but you haven't yet given a go. So what are you inspired to try? Second question, what do you need to feel confident to have a go? Do you want to do a trial run with someone? Do you want to talk to someone who's done it before? How can you resource yourself to feel confident enough to try? And then finally, this is for those of you who feel particularly brave this morning, what will happen if you don't try something new? What will happen if you don't try something new? So Rory will invite you now. We'll give you about 12, 15 minutes or so just to talk amongst yourselves. And then after that time, you'll be pulled back. You won't have to do anything. You'll just be told in 60 seconds, you'll be brought back to the main room, and then you'll come back all together and we'll see one another and we'll have some time for questions from the whole group. So look out for that invite. It's coming from Rory, and just click accept, and you'll be able to unmute yourself in the small group and meet one another. Welcome back, everyone. I'm glad to see you all returned somehow.
Yeah. I'll just wait for people to come back in, make their way in from their conversations, which I'm sure didn't feel long enough.
Welcome back, everyone, for those of you just returning.
So what we're going to move into now is just a short time of conversation and questions, and we are going to be finishing at past. And because it's so disruptive to sort of, for people to be unmuting themselves, we're going to invite you to type any questions into the chat box. And as well as any questions, if there's any sort of reflections that you want to share if there's sort of something that came up for you in your small group that you'd like to share with the group, then do feel free to write that into the chat box as well. It'd be really interesting to see that. So I think we're all back now from this room. So as I said, we're going to have some Q&A with Casper, Rebecca and Tim. So feel free to sort of type your questions into the box as well as any reflections, and we'll open up. And I think I'll read out a few questions, and then our guests can kind of choose which ones they want to reflect. So one, I feel like maybe Casper, you might know about this. I don't know if the others ones, but there's a question about doing flower communion online. I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of Unitarian tradition of flower communion.
Vaguely, but actually not well enough to be able to say anything as interesting as I know all of you would know. But I think the same principle stands. I'm thinking what is the essence of the ritual, and how can we do that in a different way? How can we communicate what's underneath the traditional form?
And there's a reflection here on traditions. So this is someone from a British Methodist background who've decided that online communion is at this stage inappropriate, but my chapel and many others are rediscovering love feasts. What other old traditions we forget about that we can rediscover?
Oh, I love that. And I know Rebecca will have interesting things to say about that, just because I think it's so true that there are always, rituals, and to some extent are always historical and cultural expressions of an eternal longing. At least that's how I think about them. And so rituals have changed over time, right? Every tradition was once an innovation. And so there are things that we don't think of now as traditional that were absolutely the heart of the tradition hundreds of years ago. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of dig into history a little bit and learn about the ways in which things were done, perhaps at a hyper-local level before, or in the home. I know more and more people are kind of finding ways to create a sacred place in their house right now. So yeah, I love that idea.
And there's a question here which I feel like Rebecca might have an interesting answer to. How do we do diverse kinds of participation beyond joys and sorrows and holding a candle that are meaningful and non-excluding?
Yes, I'm going to answer that by also just tagging on to what Casper just said about digging into history, because I think sometimes it can feel a little bit like you're just pulling things out of thin air to make up new rituals. And sometimes grabbing things from the past, even if it leads you to adapt it to the point where it would no longer be recognizable, I just find very rooting. But I also have found it rooting because it reminds me that other people have survived difficult things. All of these various traditions have actually survived a different pandemic in 1918, never mind ones long ago. And we talked about when we were working on Passover and the Jews' flight from Egypt, not all the Jews left Egypt. And at the time, America, of course, is in this absolute nonsense about some people won't do what the government's saying. That we are the descendants of the people who followed the instructions was like a very helpful sort of thing to do. But that's actually, I found very rooting. The thing about multiple options is I always think a lot about just naming what's happening, that you can say, here are different ways to engage and give people ways to opt in. Even things like you don't have to have your video camera on. Why it's lovely, because you can see each other, but of course you're welcome not to. That's a really general thing. But I would say that having that thought that I wouldn't reverse engineer it. I wouldn't say what is a tradition, what is a thing we can do that everyone can feel included in, because you're never going to find it. I would start with the thing that seems useful and powerful, and then continue to evolve it so that lots of people can use it. Otherwise, you get paralyzed really fast.
Thank you. And there's a great question here from Robin that I feel like Tim will have some good reflections on. What balance should we strike between innovating ritual for online use and trying to provide a sense of comfort through continuity?
So the online churches that I've been part of and have studied. I've looked at over a very long period of time. And one thing that I've found pretty consistently is that they were launched with a very clear idea of what they were going to do, and then they ended up doing something totally different. And that's kind of similar to what I think a few of the comments we've just heard. You can't overplan too much in advance what your community is going to be into, what will work for your congregation. It is important to try and find a way for people to feel included. It's important to try and find some way for a ritual to feel familiar. The ritual is only meaningful if we can recognize it as ritual. And that's maybe something we could now argue about for 3 hours, which we haven't got. But it's very common for a ritual to start with something that feels familiar, like a liturgical practice that we already know about, or an object that we already consider sacred, or a space that's already important to us, or a person we already consider an authority. And then from that place of familiarity, you can build the confidence to sort of work towards trying something new. And what I've found in all of the groups I've looked at is that the leader starts off and says, well, this is what we're going to do. I've got all these new ideas. And then actually the community likes some of those ideas. They don't like some others. Somebody else will have a thought. And after 6 months, they've kind of evolved in a rather different direction. One of the crucial points, I think, going right back to one of Casper's comments really early on, crisis is a time of transition. There's lots of sociological and anthropological and psychological research behind this. A crisis is a moment when people start trying something new. That can include being open to new forms of spirituality. It also can include leaving behind things that aren't working for you anymore. There are big surveys that have been done that suggest that there are some people out there who are starting to pray for the first time. They're starting to do spiritual things for the first time. The same surveys tend to also find there are people who are stopping. There are people who are leaving behind their spiritual and religious identity, and that doesn't get publicized quite as much. So one crucial thing for any Unitarian or other church or other spiritual community right now is to look for who might be falling out of your group, who is disappearing. Are there people who are starting to lose touch? And I noticed that Louise posted earlier on, is it a good idea to try and use old media to use the post, or to post audio cassettes to people who might not be online? Absolutely. That's one really effective and powerful way of just trying to make sure you've got a connection with everybody in some way who might be otherwise disappearing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. I feel like we could all keep on talking about this for a long time, but we're out of time. Thank you so much to Casper, to Rebecca, and to Tim for your really brilliant expert input today. I've learned a lot, and I hope others have as well. And yeah, I'm just really grateful that we could all be here together. And I'm really pleased to sort of see in the chat that there's an appetite for further training around how we can use sort of digital tools well. So I feel like that's an important thing to explore. And I'm going to hand back over to Casper so that we can end and close this space together.
So friends, I invite you to find your candle. Be careful as you blow it out not to have hot wax go all over your screen. I've been there, I've done that, so be gentle. But with great thanks for our time together, for Liz, for Rory, everyone who organized everything. Thanks for you for your courage and bravery in exploring this new chapter of your ministry and community leadership. Thank you so much. Wonderful, friends. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. We'll unmute you all. You can say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Sing row the boat now.
Thank you very much.
Row the boat.
Thanks so much.
Everyone. Bye.
Pop, 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 pop.
Be unmuted, as you see.